start?
All right. Well, welcome to everyone for our Christian education. I'm Cynthia Chinley and Chair of Social Justice, which is just tagging along with Christian Ed on the special guest speaker that we're having today.
Right.
So he's in Korea, so he asked me, being in the United States, to be the Zoom host. So our special guest speaker is Rosaleen Zisch. She is a very lauded teacher and has spent 22 years full-time in the Palo Alto and the San Jose school district. She was a teacher at Herbert Hoover Middle School and Edwin Markham Middle School. She's got a lot of fellowships and publications and awards, and she's also a fellow Presbyterian. Just to name one of her fellowships, she was at the California History Social Studies Fellowship at the Diversity Think Tank at UCLA. She has won the Ruth Dubel Award for the California Council for Social Studies. She was Teacher of the Year for several different associations, including the California Geography Society, the California Association for Gifted Education, and at Teacher of the Year at Hoover Middle School.
Oh.
She has been an elder and deacon at Stone Church of Willow Glen, and she has been a member of the coordinating council of the San Jose Presbytery, as well as a curriculum writer for the church school of the Presbyterian women. So we're honored to have her. She is a member of the Rumson Tribe, and I will share my screen because I have her slides up, and I will ask her to start.
Right. Thank you very much, Cindy. Yes, my tribal connection, and I do not look like my dad, but it's his side of the family that is from the Patrones, originally the northern part of Spain. And the relative of mine who came to this world, this new world, and met a Native American from a tribe close to Carmel, and she is the one that we're connected with. But we also have another relative, a great-great-grandmother, 3 greats. And she was also a Native American from another tribe. So it's all recorded. I have a number. I got a settlement because the last registration for us was in the 50s. And I was born before then, so I was registered. I've come to know them through a cousin of mine who was very involved. He actually was the chairman of the Rumsen Carmel tribe, and he died just last year. And he was very involved, and as I said, and kept us informed about what was going on. I have a cousin who's been also very interested in the family and the family history. And that is our symbol, as you would, and a very not unusual at all with those things in it. We're going to take a look at where these tribes were. And I have 2 maps to share with you today. So if you'll, Cindy, put up that first map. And the first map is zeroed in on the area that we're in. You're going to have another speaker, and she actually will be coming from the Muwika tribal group. And they're very well established. They are actually one that's recognized by the federal government. In California, we have 35 that are not recognized. And the California recognized tribes include those 35, but that's one of the tribes that is. And you'll notice underneath there's a term called Costanoan. The Costanoans was what the Spanish called all of them in this area. Anyone near the coast became the Costanoans. So the Spanish used this term, and so did the Mexicans. The term Ohlone is one that we adopted in our current period of time. And because Costanoans was very offensive to many of the native groups. So if you see it, it's only because it's historical rather than anything that people use. And if you're interested in finding out what tribal group lived where you live today, then you go to the website that says native-land cal/. So if you want to take a moment and jot that down, you can, because it's kind of fun. You get to put up your address and then they'll take you to that period or that location on the map. You can go to the bigger map if everybody got that information. Okay, the bigger map covers all of California. And now boundaries are very, they're not firm. These are approximate because most native tribes, their boundaries were by rivers, just kind of logical. The mountains are there, so we're not going to cross the mountains and we're going to stay on this side. So the sharing of the land was pretty practical. It wasn't anything that anyone fought over. And a lot of the languages of the different tribal groups are similar, but they're not the same. It doesn't mean that your tribal group could speak to the neighbors, even though you don't live that far away. You might exchange other things and you might trade, but you don't necessarily understand each other. And I always thought that was kind of interesting. My grandpa, who died in 1939, he actually spoke the native tongue of his tribe. And I looked it up because no one seemed to know what the name of it was. And I looked it up and I go, oh gosh, it was one of four. So it's not for sure either. Anyway, so let's go on to the next one. Okay, what did they live in? I always think it's interesting that we have these images thanks to like Disney and TV, and where they show you what Indians look like, and most of that is imagination. But our California Indians did build. They didn't have to build anything very strong. These huts that they made, and they used a lot of tule to make those, as well as their boats. And it was very, you could have blown them down very easily. The weather didn't make it necessary for them to build anything that was stronger. There were over 10,000 people living in our region of the Bay Area. And the missions, of course, changed everything. And we know about that. Thanks to the mission studies of the elementary school kids and the teachers, where they show them all the missions, some of which are still in good condition and many of which are not. But our Santa Clara mission, which is our, well, it's the one in the best condition because it was rebuilt in 1917, I think it was. But it was originally founded in 1777. They did not want San Jose Mission to be close to them. That's why San Jose Mission is way over there in Fremont. And they did not want the competition. They wanted the local people that were living in the Pueblo of San Jose. They wanted those people to have to come to their mission for a Sunday program or worship. It was an all-day thing to get there because El Camino still hadn't been totally finished, but eventually it was. And that's the road they took. So when the Spanish came with their priests, and the people got the choice. They could either be killed, be moved, or work for them. And so it was the Bible and the gun were the way they approached this. And they did the same thing in South America and everywhere they went, this was their approach. And this is our Catholic people, and the Pope claiming them as part of his world. So the picture on the right is a depiction of what their life would be more like if living at one of the missions. And of course, a lot of the missions treated the Indians like slaves. It was not a wonderful life for them. But a couple of the missions weren't so bad. So it was very much an individual thing, and it depended on which priests were in charge and how they saw the Indians, whether they saw them as human beings or as animals, and their interpretations of just what value they had. But there are some rather nice things written. Father Sarah is not the evil man that some people seem to think he is. He did write some beautiful things about the native tribes, but then he wasn't at all of them either. And I won't. There's one that's particularly horrible, but it's down south. Okay, let's move along, and we're going to take a look at what myths have come down to us. And I already mentioned the fact that a lot of kids all think that Indians had horses, and they had feather caps that, sat on their heads, and they had buffalo, and there's just these various stereotypes. And one of the biggest ones, of course, is around Thanksgiving. And if you believe that, then you're in deep trouble. And I was going to pull it up to show you. And if somebody's interested, I can send the name to Cindy or to Suke, because there's a really good book written for kids, but it's well done and with the real history of Thanksgiving. So prior to the Pilgrims, though, there was another group that came in, and if you want to go to the next picture, it shows some of these stereotypes, right? So that Thanksgiving colony, so many people in that area, the native tribes, had already been wiped out, or the disease had been brought to them, not by the English settlers that ended up staying there, but by mostly the Dutch, and there were some mercenaries, English mercenaries. And there's several stories about that. It was really brutal. Our Pilgrims would not have survived without the Indian help in those first few years, because none of them were farmers that made that trip, and they needed to learn a lot of stuff in order to survive. I always think of our big fat turkeys that we get. The turkeys they had were really skinny turkeys, and they were a wild bird that just ran around, and was one of the easiest ones to catch and eat. And some of the meals that they had were, talk about primitive, and but if it wasn't for the native population, they wouldn't even have known what to catch or how to cook it. So they learned a great deal. Excuse me. And yes, we caused a lot of harm when we came. And how has the church been involved in that? The early Christian church, of course, used their own blueprint about how you organize and how you teach people. And we're going to talk a little more about the doctrine of discovery. that was so destructive to our native population. And then the land, the thing about land is the native population never claimed they owned the land. The land belonged to everyone. They had a way of approaching land and animals, and as a holistic way of seeing the world, and value of it was for everyone. And they really held pretty true to that. The stories about how they shared and their spiritual connections with their environment are really quite beautiful. And they had a way of preserving the environment that we're looking at seriously, and have been doing some of it in this state. And that's a way of burning, where you know when it is right to burn the growth in order to make it better and stronger. And I saw a presentation by Santa Cruz Indian group on this, and they demonstrated it, and it was really impressive, and very complimentary to people who are into saving our environment, and recognizing that we're making so many mistakes, and have been making so many mistakes that we need to rectify. And of course, water was important to them. It's as it is important to us, and how you preserve it and how you use it. And the colonization that went on in the past was a very destructive thing to much of the water that was needed to grow many of their plants and produce things in the rightful way. So this is a guide that was put together, this sheet, and used for conversations, and that's why there's questions on it, which we won't take the time today to go over. So let's see the next slide. Okay, so when we talk about whose land are you on, that's that, and I'm repeating it for you down here. It's the native-land period cal, and that's when you can find out where it is, that, or who it is that probably lived in the area that you're in now. And white settlers, of course, like we are, private property, towns, countries, states, were all into naming things. And I always think it's amusing when my students can't figure out that the Spanish were here first, when half of the names of things in California are Spanish, including California. Anyway, it's from the Latin, but they named them when they came, and most of those names stuck in one form or another. Some of them have been changed a bit, and others were lengthened, and there were some, of course, are named after the people who got here first. And I was just talking to somebody who lives in Campbell and telling them about their founder, and the fact about where he came from and how he ended up in Campbell. But there's some of you live in like places like San Mateo, and San Mateo, of course, is Saint Matthew, right? No, no, I'm going to get it wrong. I need to use a different example. Anyway, but we know that San Francisco, for instance, is Saint Francis, and he was the Franciscans were a very prominent Catholic order in this area. So we have more than one name like that. And a critical step in disrupting settler colonization is acknowledging that this land is rightfully indigenous territory. it is important to know exactly whose territory you are on. So when you look that up, you're going to find out who would have lived here in those days. And remember, one of the things that I learned not very long ago, actually, it was a very interesting talk that I went to, is that few of the native of people who have the ancestry connected to our Indian forefathers can even live here. It's just too expensive. And this person is from Los Altos, and she said, well, it's only because on my white side I've got all this money, but there's no way that the other side of my family could possibly afford to live here. But she knew about her ancestors, and that was nice to hear. So let's move along, and we're going to look at water and the importance of water for our life, and how how this has changed. And we all know this one. Alviso, of course, used to be a big port, and you probably don't know that. Although some of you may know it, because it was a place that lots of people had their boats. And now, of course, they've started the harbor again, still small. But the Guadalupe River had large tanker type ships that went down it during the Civil War. They were carrying copper and things like that from Almaden mines and to Alviso, and then they were put on bigger ships up to San Francisco, and eventually would end up on the East Coast to be made into things that supported the war. But colonization is not something bad that happened in the past, but an ongoing effort. Corporate and government-backed resource extractions continue to threaten indigenous peoples, land, resources, waters, traditional foods, economics, and forms of government or governance. As we reckon with what indigenous people face, we must center the ways that indigenous peoples are on the front lines of producing water, land, water, sacred places, and knowledge. We have a need for clean water, air, and food for all people, but especially for our people that are at the bottom of our economics, and they truly are. In fact, it's shocking. They are 24% of the indigenous or native peoples are at the poverty level, and that makes them the minority that has the most people at the poverty level. And I think that's a surprise to a lot of people that they are as bad off as they are. And if they've been moved to cities, which was a big attempt this century, not a long time ago, but in the 60s, they tried to move natives off their reservations, and they tried to reduce the size of reservations. And one tribe in North Dakota just got so many thousand acres returned to them that had been taken away in the 1960s. A lot of them in the 1960s were literally moved to cities. And that's why up in Oakland, there's a whole area of Native Americans that we actually had ministry to them for some time. I don't know if that's still active, but we did have a program up there. But they were moved there, and they were given very little to live on. It wasn't as if they were going to be getting ongoing support. And so that was one of those awful things that our government did. And it just, it follows with a number of other awful things. And those would be natives of this region on one of our rivers, and using their Thule boats. let's go to the next one now. And this is a kind of an overview. We do support the Native American churches that we have. And we had 36, and I believe we still have 36. Several of them are very small, and a couple of them are still on a reservation. But we have a way to reach them. They were doing one of them was doing a big campaign because their church needed repair, and they did get a lot of support, which was nice to hear. And it was very cute church. They painted it blue, and it's in Idaho, Carmel, Idaho, and it was built in 1871. And so it's one of the churches that we have retained. There's, like I said, there's a number of others. And if you want to reach out, we have a Native American Day that our church celebrates. And it's the 22nd of this month. Yeah, September 22nd. And I'm not sure, they suggest different things that you can do. And I love the way they have the Native American version of the Lord's Prayer. It's you might want to check that out. It's I think it's rather lovely, and something that we might want to think about using. I did use it with a group of youth, and they seem to like it. They keep us away from wrongdoings and free us from all evil. They especially like that part, wrongdoings and evil. Anyway, okay, so there's a local group that is working to gain recognition by the federal government, and that's the Rumson group, and they have a website that tells you about it. It's got a petition on the website to support their work, and they're looking for donations as well. But the story is there, and they actually have made a couple of trips to Washington, D.C. Looking for support on that one. There's anyway, these are all our local tribes, and that I wanted to point out to you. Okay, so on the next page, I want to share with you the doctrine of discovery. And this is what is so really scary about what we did do and what we're not doing now, thank the Lord. But this is our statement of confession by our church first, in the General Assembly, which some of you may have gone to. This is the 222nd one where they adopted this doctrine. And it recommends that the confession repudiate the doctrine and apologize to tribes in our areas and citizens of the Native American or citizens of Native American ancestry. The confession lists many things, including the Indian assimilation movement, boarding schools, etc. And I don't know, do any of you know about the boarding schools that they put Indian children at? I see Vida is raising, nodding, I can tell. Right, so you're familiar with it. It's a very sad story. It's quite ugly. And the part that gets me, though, Vida, is that this century, I mean, not back in the 1800s or early 1900s, but in the 1950s, they were still restricting who could adopt an Indian child. and they were allowing them to be adopted by anyone but an Indian. They did not want them adopted by other Indians or native folk. And I thought that was terrible when I read that. It was actually a law that needed to be changed, and it took a long time to change it. Because I just assumed they all were torn down or their schools are gone, and it just wasn't so. Anyway, the gospel of Christ was not understood to the arrogant Western European culture. Land agreements were broken and tribes left with no power. We seek God's forgiveness and healing grace, and that's basically what we want to confess and to make sure does not happen anymore. Some parts of the country were especially, they found it especially destructive. And I read about a tribe that went from a good large size to a very small size, thanks to colonists coming in and taking the land, and the Indians not being able to get their land back. Instead, they were moved. And in fact, there's one tribal group that was moved 4 times within the state of Ohio. And they finally ended up way at the north of Ohio, where you can barely live due to the very cold and mean kind of climate. They had started out south of Detroit. So if any of you know what that state looks like, that's a real extreme. And they just kept moving them. The soldiers would come in and pack them up, and off they'd go. So it's a lot of stories that are not very pretty. And of course, our native tribe in Ohio, the fact that they discovered oil after being moved there, and they looked like they were actually moved to a place that had no resources, and it turned out to have oil. And then the government tried to take the land back, but those Indians were smart. They at least got some white folk lawyers to help them. And so they were not bumped off their land. Okay, I think I have one more slide to share today. And this is, it's actually not quite a poem, but it's been written by Reverend Stephen Charleston, and I wanted to share this with you. Something sacred is coming this way. That is how my ancestors would have said it in the midst of all this turmoil and confusion. When we cannot clearly see the path before us, when we feel trapped in a situation we cannot control, then I believe the wise elders of my holy heritage would climb to the high place of the heart, draw the circle of reason and faith around them, stand to sing their prayers into the open sky of the history to come. They would not shrink into a corner afraid, but rise up to catch the first light of what was coming into being all around them. We are living in a time of emergence. We are witnesses to a great renewal. The world is full of the fear of birth and change, but that transformation will one day be our blessing. Do not be afraid, but be believing. Come to the place where the ancestors are already standing. Come and see. Something sacred is coming this way. Amen.
Amen.
And that concludes my formal presentation, but I'd be happy to visit with you or answer any of your questions that you would like to offer. I see Margaret's hand, I think, right? Yeah. Hi, Margaret. Oh, unmute yourself. Yeah.
One question was if you could explain, I've heard what the benefits of federal recognition are that so many of these local small tribes don't have
Right.
and want.
Okay. With federal recognition, you can have a casino. And, yeah. And some of the casinos are very well organized. And they do benefit, the natives do benefit from them. There's a one in Canada, I know. I should have an example that's a little closer, but that one, they run the schools and the kids get full scholarships. And if they test out, because they only have a small school on the reservation, so a lot of them are funded in order to go to a better school, and that means transportation and the cost of the school as well. So, and lots of them, the one in Palm Springs, that particular Indian reservation are not in, on that Indian reservation, they have a casino, and all the employees have to be registered Indians. It doesn't matter where they're registered or which tribe they're from, but they do have to be at least part Indian in order to work there. And they do provide a lot of jobs, not housing, but jobs. So
then, just to follow up, if you're not a registered Indian, at the beginning you said you were registered, but there was a cutoff that any descendants that born later could not be. Was that because it was too diluted, or what was it?
Yes, right. Not enough. You know, they say 16% is supposed to be the end of it, and I happen to be one of the latter ones. My grandpa died in 1938, and he had two families, and like my dad's side actually lived in Mexico for 12 years before he brought them up here. But he had a home here. Well, in San Luis Obispo, he had a home, and then he ended up in Castroville. But his two families didn't necessarily talk to each other. My grandma did not talk much to his first wife, who was much older than she was. But the registrations took place, and he had to, on his paperwork, which actually was started in 1911. So my grandpa goes back a long way, and I have copies of all of this. And on that one, he said they had to get in contact with this one granddaughter in order to get any other names. These were the only names he had. And fortunately, he had my dad, and my dad's, he didn't have his daughter, which I always thought was interesting, but he had his boys, and that's my father. Right.
So if two registered Indians, you know, even marry, then their children can continue the membership.
Right. They'd go through their tribe itself now.
It's complicated.
Yeah, because I'm sure one of them at least, like my grandpa apparently told the state people that were evaluating you as to whether you were Indian or not. And he told them his family always just said we were mission Indians, and rather than a tribal group, which I thought was kind of interesting.
There's something really offensive about the whole scheme.
Oh, yes.
To say absurdly offensive.
Absolutely. Because some of them were, they still had their tribal name, and were really familiar with that, and had their ancestors tracked, and were able to celebrate those things. But many of the mission Indians had lost all of that. Yeah. And depending on what they did for a living, one of mine came here to the Pueblo, and he grew pears. He had a pear orchard down on Monterey, well, is now Monterey Road. Yeah. I don't know, pears, I don't know. Anyway, but that's what it says. So, right. I think you had something, Vida. Yes.
Yes, actually, our retirement home is in the Sierra, near Arnold. It's actually in the town of Dorrington, 8 miles, a little bit further north, and the Sierra Miwok are
wonderful.
yes. And I had the pleasure of going to a seminar by a Miwok, Adam Lewis, this past August 23rd, that he gave at the Calaveras Big Tree State Park. And I'm a member of the Calaveras Big Tree Park Association, the nonprofit that helps to support. And there's the Jackson Rancheria, which is very, very does very well. There's the Black Oak Casino also up here. And some of the profits there go towards education of the children in their native language and their customs and their songs and things like that. Adam was speaking about the change of direction, turning now to learning the stewardship practices of the Native Americans. Actually, artifacts of the Miwok have been found going back 11,000 years in this area, and they knew what they were doing. Yes. And the colonists didn't know what they were doing.
Not at all. No.
Not at all. So I wanted to mention, those aspects. And I also want to mention that Adam spoke very much about the black oak and the importance of that in that making flour from the black oak actually carried them through the winters. And in the winter they go further down in lower altitudes. And they also traded with the Washoe, who are more on the eastern side, and they would trade pinyon nuts for black oak, back and forth. Yes. And that was very interesting. So the other thing I want to mention is there is an Indian Grinding Rock State Park, which is a bit north of us here. And it, among other things, has a roundhouse that is actually used for ceremonies. And they hold a powwow in early September. And actually, Calaveras Big Trees Association, or CBTA as we call it, runs a visitor's gift shop at the Calaveras Big Tree State Park, and one of our employees is a Miwok young lady. And so I just want to say that the Miwok, I don't know if they have a reservation or what, but they certainly are members of our community, and they are carrying out some of their native customs. And you mentioned the boarding schools. One of the things they did, besides taking the children away from their families, which is horrible to start with, is they did not allow them to speak their native language. And so many of these wonderful languages, particularly of the smaller tribes, have disappeared, have become extinct because of that gap.
Very true.
I just wanted to say a little bit, the very little that I know about some of the Native Americans up in this area.
Right. Yeah, the Miwok have always been organized. It's interesting. They go back 60, 70 years or something. And I actually visited, they have that museum up there, don't they?
Yes, they do. Very lovely museum.
Right. So I have visited that. And they also make their own baskets too, don't they?
They do beautiful work.
Yes. Because we forget the way they carried around these things that they made was with the handmade baskets. And some of the tribes have been teaching that again as a way for their children to learn. And I tried to make a basket. My basket wasn't too good. No.
Some of those baskets are so finely woven they can carry water in them.
Oh yeah, they're incredible. They're really incredible. I own one, but it's not the one I made would be, I'm not going to show it to you guys. You all laugh. Yeah, I don't have, there's a number of skills. Now I can eat the food. and I could pound those. And I did make some of the flat breads that we can buy now in stores, and they call them all kinds of wonderful Middle Eastern names, but basically it's the same stuff that our native tribes made too, depending on whether they used corn or whether they used well, we had a lot. You mentioned the one tree, and then of course we had the pods too that we pounded down, right?
And they would take special care of the oak trees. Oak trees have a habit of 1 year they'll produce a lot, and then they'll sort of hibernate for a while. You know, they call them masts when at the time that, and they became very familiar with their individual trees, and you know when they were going to have a good harvest, and they would be careful to remove competition, competing plants, so that the trees would get the water they needed. And they did what we call now prescribed burns. In other words, low intensity burns to eliminate competition, and also to return the ash to the soil, which would return nutrients to the soil. So it's very interesting. And now we are finally starting to include them in decision-making positions, because we can learn so much from them about stewardship of the land.
We've had several of those burns now, very successfully done in the valley, and so there's plans for more, but you do have to be taught how to do them.
Oh yeah, you don't just go out
you
there.
can't just go out there. Right. So
I see Ellen had her hand up, and also Melissa has a comment in the chat, and Suki also had his hand up. So
okay, right. Who was first, Cindy?
and maybe was first.
Okay, Ellen?
Yeah, my question was, is there only one sort of official indigenous prayer, but Lord's Prayer? But I went online and found a couple of examples of it. The YouTube has a woman playing pipe in the background, and it's very nice. I also am interested in Melissa's question. Can you address terminology, Indian, Native, Indigenous? Thank you.
Right. Are you talking about ancestry, or are you talking about in general?
What language we should use?
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, you know, I did talk with the tribal chair of now I'm going to get her, I want to say her tribe correct. It'll come back to me. I met her at a national conference, and here's this tall, very attractive redheaded gal. And I said, it's hard to believe that you're, you know, Native American. And she said, oh, no, get away from any stereotypes. We come in every size, shape, and color. And she says, it just depends on where we lived and who, you know, whether we had any exchanges with other people or whatever. But she said, you can never, whatever you look like, it doesn't matter. Your ancestry is what your ancestry is and what you want to claim. And I asked her about the same question that you guys just had. Do you want to be called Indians? Do you want to be called American Indians? Do you want to be called Native Americans? Do you have a preference? And she said, actually, I don't. I am an American and I am an Indian. If it helps to distinguish me from other Americans or other people who come from the country of India, then Native is fine. If you're talking with archaeologists, then you better use indigenous, because you need to distinguish that you're people that were here. Your ancestors were here thousands of years ago. So I thought that was very interesting. And she certainly was somebody who could speak for a lot of people.
I have heard that, or I read, I don't know whether it was in braiding sweetgrass or what,
Mhm.
but the notion that the name America was from Amerigo Vespucius or whatever,
Right.
an Italian,
Mhm.
makes that not a great choice.
It's a European term. Yeah.
Right, right.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, the way language is taken over by different groups in terms of historical time periods, it's sometimes really hard. Tribes will tell you that they like to be called their tribe name. Just as you were talking about the Miwok, they'd much prefer to be called that, I know, than to be called Indian. And there would be no question about that. And I talked to somebody not too long ago who was working with a project, and she said the Ohlone term. I said, that's an artificial term. It really doesn't describe anybody. And she said, but wait, a lot of people have some ancestral connection. However, they don't have any idea what tribal group. Their family didn't keep any records and they have nothing to refer on. So they like to be called Ohlone, and we're happy to call them Ohlone. And I thought that was kind of interesting because I'm very aware of that being something that we created, and we created in my lifetime. I mean, it's something that you wouldn't have found in earlier books. In fact, I have a book, a college book, that talks about creating Ohlone and the term and having the tribes adopt it. And they adopted it very nice. I mean, nobody forced it down their throat. They were very comfortable, apparently, adopting it. So
I love the Canadian term First Nations.
yeah, I do too. I like that. Right.
Hey, Rosaleen, when I was in school in Korea, we were told that the American Indians or American natives are closely or remotely connected to Asians in their bloodline and also in culture. For example, Korea traditionally has an ancestor worship, the tradition, and young babies, newborn babies, have blue birthmarks on their bottoms and backs. Do you do Americans or do you? I'm sorry, American natives and or you, do you share the same opinion about that?
I think there's been a lot of research, and there's some very strong opinions about the connection, because there was a land connection at one time, and that's been proven between the two continents. So you could have gotten, there was a land bridge, if you want to use that term, but you could have gotten to this continent from Asia. They were connected. So the chance of people coming is very likely. What is amusing to me is to have my nephew do the blood test to discover what racial makeup he is, and the native Indian came up, but also Asian came up. And it's a very small amount, but both of them are very small amounts. And I thought, I was very amused by that. It didn't come up on mine, but it certainly came up on his. And of course, that's a whole different thing. And trying to track that kind of stuff.
So if I properly dress up, and then can I pass for an American Indian?
Actually, you know what? I have one relative that you really would look a lot like him if you stood with that group.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could mention, I am a biologist, and yeah, that land bridge, it's the Bering land bridge basically that you refer to. That was there, doing very well and being pretty big about 15,000 years ago. So that would serve as, and also DNA studies, which are being widely done these days, do show the similarities between Asian and Native Americans, or whatever we're going to call them, and that there are certain genes and things that appear in those two groups that do not appear in Europeans, and that sort of thing. So it's quite well confirmed by different sources of evidence.
Right.
One more question. When Christianity came to Korea, there was a strong social conflict because Korea had a traditional culture and religion, and Christianity denied those traditional religion and enforced a new religion. And some of the new religion and the Christianity goes against our traditional culture. I presume that American Indians experienced the same thing when the Western Christianity was introduced. Is it true, or how in Indian society the Christianity is accepted or perceived?
Yeah, because they also decided to take children away to be totally Americanized or European culture, cutting their hair, changing their way of dress, keeping them from their language, as Vida said. That was a really big thing, the language. And that's why it's so important, or it's this new look at what we do with our young children and teaching them their languages or their traditions. Each tribal group had a little different way of looking at the world. The terms are different, not terribly different, but they all have stories about creation, and they all have stories about what happens to you if you don't do good. It's very interesting. I have samples of a number of books that come from different tribal groups, and there's one that comes from the Rumsen people, and it's about their favorite bird and what happens to the bird in his lifetime. But it's the different animals become important, and somebody mentioned First People, which is our Canadian friends, and they have those beautiful stories about animals that are common to them. You would not find those same animals in the Southwest, for instance. So the Southwest natives use a different kind of animal, but animals become very important to them. So but the stories are similar in terms of what they cover, what ideas they cover. And that's where you go to when the Christians came, and they emphasized, of course, Jesus, because he suffered and he offered them a way for the future and eternal life. So these were real important stories. Understanding God was not something that the natives expected to ever do, because God was all over, and he was the great spirit. And you find that's very familiar too. So there's certain themes that you will find in all of their backgrounds, or their and why it appealed, why some adopted Christianity while others didn't. And I had the joy of going to a week seminar, and it was led by she was from I started to say she's from the South Dakota area. But she was native to 2 different tribal groups, and she was also a Presbyterian minister. And she was trying to show us how the church can work for our native people, but not necessarily. Why they do fade out, especially if they move to a big city and come up with all the conflicts and problems. But if they stay on their reservations, there's a better chance of them staying with the church or staying with this, a Christian faith, because we can explain how we're alike and how we're different, and make it seem like a path you can follow. We lose, of course, we lose a lot of young people as well in big cities. So it's just all the challenges, I guess, and general threats to their being and to their understanding. Yeah, that's pretty grim. Yeah. Did that
Thank you.
answer your question?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay. I feel like running and going and getting my bird book. I think it's in there with the basket that doesn't work. Oh, yes, Evan.
Following up on what we were just talking about the young people, are any in the recent years of online work been able to stay on the reservations and have a good livelihood?
Do you know, Evan, that's an excellent question. I feel like I should be looking this up. We know about, there was a recent article, I just finished reading it, and that was in Horizons, which is a magazine for Presbyterian women. And they actually sponsored a group of women from different parts of the United States to live on a reservation for, I think it was 3 weeks, and get to know how the people lived, what their traditions were. And I know that was a really well thought of experience. And then, of course, we're able to take it back to their own areas with them. And there are some that are in better shape than others, some reservations. There are some that are in very poor condition. And part of it is how the money is distributed. And an acquaintance of mine who was from the New Mexico area, and he was an alcoholic, and he used to say that we who are and he had a cute kind of phrase for it, but basically what he was saying that if we have the blood of our ancestors, we have a tendency to drink and drink too much. And I don't know if that's still true, but it certainly was at one point that alcoholism was rampant at several reservations. It was part of the reason the money was wasted and not used in a productive way. There are very primitive ways of living on some of the reservations too. There's a Native American writer who's from the state of Washington originally, lives in Seattle now, but he's written several books about reservation life, and or the characters in his books come from reservation life, and I know I was part of spoke to a group of English teachers, and I got to hear him speak about about his books and why he felt that one of them was very successful, but the other one not so much. And
But he had stayed on the reservation.
yeah, right, exactly. But he did. He said that the one that was better received was the one that was more rooted in reservation life. And as he moved away from that, yes, I mean, he got himself a job actually teaching English at a junior college, but he also didn't sound as happy as he had been. And he had, of course, been one of those kids that qualified for a scholarship on the reservation. And but he also was a pretty good basketball player, so that didn't hurt him either. Yeah. Right. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, if I could comment, I think that one of the the genes that the Native Americans and Asians have in common is a way that the liver metabolizes alcohol. Yeah. And so seriously, I'm not kidding. I think I read this somewhere. So it's, and it is not a good thing. The other thing is, I wonder if anybody else is a fan of the Tony Hillerman series of mysteries. I love them, and they're being continued by his daughter, Anne.
Yes.
So, and they have some things about the Native Americans and their customs and rituals. Very interesting, you know.
Right. They've been sensitive to, so they've not been sensitive to things that shouldn't be shared and things that should. Dark Winds, which just finished on TV, and Redford was one of the producers of it, is about some of those same characters from the early books. And it's very well done. And shows that conflict between the white people with money and the natives who actually own the land or should be living better than they are for a variety of reasons. You know, it's that old thing, education, and you've got to give them more and better, and if you expect improvements. Anyway.
Things like water and electricity also help.
Oh, holy sakes. You mean plumbing?
Or just access to clean water, you know?
Yeah, it's true. It's true, especially in some of the areas, because of course they were given land by our government that nobody else wanted. Yeah, for the most part.
Yeah. May I share a story that you may not believe? And
sure. Cherokee. I'm sorry. I just remembered the name of the woman who was the chairman with the red hair. She was a Cherokee chief. So, and they're a well-known organized tribe. Yeah. See, it's one of those moments, I'm telling you. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. You all may think that I'm a little crazy if I share the story, but various psychic abilities run through my mother's family side. By the way, I'm Puerto Rican, so you know people have stereotypes about Puerto Ricans too, based on West Side Story. But anyhow, we come in different shapes and colors. And one of my cousins was driving one day, and she turned onto this road in a rural area of Tennessee. And all of a sudden, she had this overwhelming feeling of sadness, of sorrow, of a weight on her chest, you know, and as if people were moaning and, you know, mourning. And she thought, what? In fact, this was so strong that she had to pull over. She felt she couldn't drive, you know, tears were streaming down her face. And so there she was, almost paralyzed by this. And she pulled over, and there was a farmer in that field doing his work, and he came over to see if she was having car trouble or something. And you know, she explained what she was feeling and why she felt she couldn't drive anymore. And he said, you know, This is part of the Trail of Tears. So you can now all think that I'm a little crazy, but that's okay. But that
No, I don't think so.
actually happened to my cousin, that feeling, and she related that story. So,
I think space gets imprinted by the people who live there. And if it's anything that stays there long enough, it's, if you had that kind of a seer kind of ability, native tribes have certain rituals that they do. I participated in one ritual, which I thought was really touching, but they're different, and you have to have a leader, and you have to be, the leader needs, I love this, the leader has to be chosen by the people. No one can just announce that they can do this, or they will do it, or they'll be the leader. No, the leader must be chosen by the people. And this was one of those wonderful things that I was able to participate in. But there are people who like to pretend they're leaders and try to do some of these rituals that they've read about or something, and it's just not appropriate. No.
Comments. I know we're going over, but
yes.
I was gonna say that you mentioned that the missions had various reputations, sometimes not being so great to the indigenous people, and sometimes they were okay. When I visited Mission San Juan Bautista, I also had this really sad feeling because in the tour of the mission, there is a burial ground where they have thousands of indigenous people buried because of the, they were enslaved or whatever. They chose death, but it gave me a very awful feeling to be there. The other one that I was going to mention, and maybe Ellen would be appreciative of this because she's former president of the League of Women Voters, that I wrote a book about women and the right to vote. And I do know that it was not really a coincidence that it was Seneca Falls where the first women's rights convention was, because the women of New York were very much inspired by the matriarchal aspect of some of the tribes in New York. And the women in the Native American tribes had more rights. They could vote for the chief. They could vote whether they would go to war or not than the colonial women.
Yeah.
And that was part of their inspiration for organizing. So I wanted to mention that because we owe that women's suffrage, some of that progress in the movement and the beginning of the movement to the women of those tribes in New York.
Right. Thank you, Cindy. That's very important, I think. And of course, Seneca Falls is a great place to visit. It does have good vibes. But I can certainly understand what you're talking about in terms of San Juan Bautista. Yes. Thank you very much. I hope this was okay for everybody. I wasn't quite sure what all you wanted to hear, and I hope you've heard something that was of value, and bless you all. And thank you for inviting me. Right.
Thank you so much.
One question again. One question again, repeating Melissa, is do you happen to have a short bibliography that you could share with us?
Well, I could. I just would take me a little bit. I could put it together.
That you can get to Cindy or Suki.
I have one. It's right here. No, I have 4 books in this other bag. No, I can put something together. Sure.
That would be great. Thank you.
You know what, Ellen, though, that would be good discipline on my part. So I'm one of these people, I read and gather and gather. And so when he asked me to do this, I started gathering, right? Oh my goodness. Did I have a pile 2 days ago? Anyway, no, I'd be happy to do that. And shall I send it to Suki? Shall I send it to you or to?
Yes, you can send to me as well as to Cynthia.
Right.
Anyway, yeah, if you send it
It-
to me, then I'll
right.
distribute.
It'll just be a page, I'm sure. Right. Okay. Happy to do it. Right.
Okay.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank
All right,
you.
Rosaleen, thank you very much. We